August 15, 1944, 2:47 a.m., 18,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. The oxygen mask couldn't hide Lieutenant Commander Richard Fleming's tension as he stared at the eerie green glow of the radar scope of his F6F-5N Hellcat. The veteran night fighter pilot, 24, studied the contact materializing on his AN/APS-6 display. Bogey bearing 030, 4 miles, he transmitted to his controller aboard the destroyer below, unable to suppress the adrenaline spike as the luminous blip crawled across his 5-inch cathode ray tube screen. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly black, the distinction between ocean and sky erased by total darkness. Above Fleming, 16 F6F-5N Hellcats of Night Fighting Squadron 76 orbited in loose formation, their flame-dampened exhausts barely visible, waiting for Japanese bombers to penetrate their protective screen around the American task force. To Navy pilots accustomed to visual dogfighting under the sun, these nocturnal hunters appeared almost supernatural. Black-painted Hellcats equipped with mysterious radar pods, hunting enemies they couldn't see with technology most couldn't understand. What Japanese commanders didn't know, what none of the bomber pilots climbing through the darkness could have imagined, was that they were flying into a technological trap that would systematically destroy Japan's ability to attack at night. Within 12 months, these radar-equipped Hellcats would transform from experimental curiosities into instruments of aerial dominance, their .650 caliber Browning machine guns becoming the last sound Japanese aircrew heard in the Pacific darkness. The mathematics of interception were already loaded in Fleming's cockpit. One AN/APS-6 radar unit weighing 230 pounds, capable of detecting aircraft at 5 miles, a rotating parabolic antenna scanning the darkness faster than human eyes could ever sweep. Enough concentrated technology to turn night from sanctuary into killing ground. The transformation began that August night when Fleming's radar operator, himself, spotted the incoming raid positioning for attack on the fleet. The former dayfighter pilot, who had transitioned to night operations just months earlier, understood what conventional fighter pilots didn't yet know, that survival in nocturnal combat required abandoning everything they thought they knew about air-to-air warfare. The F6F-5N night fighter represented a radical departure from conventional naval aviation philosophy. While the Japanese had pursued visual interception tactics even at night, relying on searchlights and luck, the U.S. Navy had created something unprecedented, a single-seat, carrier-based interceptor that used electronics, instrumentation, and pilot skill to redefine the rules of night warfare. Among the 42 American night fighter pilots spread across the dark Pacific sky that night were men who would become legends, future aces whose names would strike fear into Japanese hearts. But on August 15, 1944, they were specialists in an unproven technology, facing an enemy who owned the night through sheer audacity and years of experience. This story is about how technological innovation defeated tactical tradition, how electronics and determination merged into overwhelming superiority, and how Japanese confidence turned to terror as they discovered what radar-directed Browning machine guns could do to an aircraft in total darkness. The F6F-5N Hellcat night fighter had emerged from a 1943 crisis. As American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, Japanese commanders received urgent reports from their air crews. They were being slaughtered during daylight by Hellcat dayfighters that boasted kill ratios approaching 19-1. What Japanese tactical officers developed instead was a campaign that redefined psychological warfare, nocturnal harassment raids. "They will bomb us every night," Admiral Mark Mitcher admitted to his staff aboard USS Lexington, "and we will lose sleep, effectiveness, and men." The statistics from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan told a grim story. Japanese single bombers, sometimes ancient biplanes barely capable of carrying ordnance, would attack American positions after midnight. The damage was minimal. A few craters, occasional ammunition dump explosions, maybe a parked aircraft destroyed. But the psychological impact was catastrophic. Marines and sailors stationed on captured islands reported the pattern. Air raid sirens at 0100 hours, scramble to defensive positions. Bombs falling randomly, silence, try to sleep. Another raid at 0300 hours, repeat until dawn. American commanders called them washing machine Charlie raids after the distinctive unsynchronized engine sound of Japanese night raiders. The constant interruption of sleep reduced combat effectiveness by 30% according to medical studies. Men became irritable, made mistakes, lost their edge. But here's what made it unbearable. American night defenses could do almost nothing about it. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blind, tracer rounds arcing uselessly into the darkness, revealing their positions to bombers overhead. Searchlights swept the sky, hoping for lucky illumination, rarely finding targets. Day fighter pilots, trained for visual combat, were helpless after sunset. The U.S. Navy needed a solution desperately. They needed fighters that could hunt in complete darkness. They needed radar-equipped interceptors that could operate from carriers. They needed night fighters immediately. The concept of carrier-based night fighting wasn't entirely new to World War II. The British had experimented with radar-equipped Fulmars and later Sea Mosquitoes, though carrier operations remained limited. The Americans watched these developments closely while developing their own solutions. The Army Air Force was building the P-61 Black Widow, a purpose-designed twin-engine night fighter with crew-operated radar and heavy armament. It was impressive, powerful, and completely unsuitable for carrier operations. The aircraft weighed over 20,000 pounds and required a runway longer than any carrier deck. The Navy couldn't wait for specialized designs and couldn't operate large twin-engine aircraft from carriers practically. The solution was obvious but challenging. Adapt their most successful fighter, the F6F Hellcat, for night operations. But this wasn't a simple paint job and some extra instruments. Converting a day fighter into an effective night interceptor required solving several complex problems simultaneously. First, radar systems small enough and light enough to fit in a single-engine fighter without destroying its performance. Second, pilots who could fly instruments in total darkness while simultaneously operating radar and hunting enemy aircraft, all alone, no radar operator to help. Third, cockpit lighting that provided instrument readability without destroying night vision were making the aircraft visible to enemies. The Navy established VFN-75, the first dedicated night fighter squadron, in April 1943 and began testing various radar configurations. The initial attempts used primitive radar systems, but these were quickly replaced by something revolutionary: the AN/APS-6 Airborne Intercept Radar. Now we reach the technological breakthrough that made everything possible: the AN/APS-6 radar system that transformed the Hellcat from day fighter into night hunter. The AN/APS-6 was an X-band radar operating at approximately 10,000 megahertz. That's a wavelength of about 3 centimeters. Why does wavelength matter? Physics. Shorter wavelengths provide better resolution and allow smaller antennas. This was crucial for mounting radar in a fighter aircraft without creating a barn door of drag. The entire system weighed exactly 230 pounds, remarkably light considering its capabilities. The antenna housing sat in a streamlined pod mounted on the starboard wing, looking like an elongated teardrop fairing, approximately 44 inches long. This pod added surprisingly little drag when properly designed. Inside that innocuous-looking pod sat a small parabolic dish antenna that rotated continuously, scanning the airspace ahead like an electronic eye that never blinked. Here's how the physics worked. The radar transmitted short pulses of radio frequency energy, microwaves essentially. When those pulses struck something solid, an aircraft, terrain, even dense rain, some energy reflected back. The radar receiver detected these returns and displayed them on a cathode ray tube screen in the cockpit. The display was mounted on the right side of the instrument panel, angled slightly toward the pilot for easier viewing. It was a circular screen approximately 5 inches in diameter, about the size of a modern smartphone, though infinitely more primitive. The center of the scope represented the Hellcat's position, and radar returns appeared as bright phosphorescent blips against the dark screen. Concentric range rings allowed the pilot to estimate distance to contacts. The AN/APS-6 could detect bomber-sized targets at approximately 5 miles under optimal conditions, though realistic detection ranges ran closer to 2 to 4 miles, depending on target size, weather, and sea state interference. Against a fighter-sized target, detection range dropped to 1 to 2 miles, sometimes less. That might seem inadequate until you consider the alternative. At night, without radar, your effective detection range was essentially zero, unless you literally saw the enemy's exhaust flames or caught a lucky silhouette against moonlit clouds. The radar incorporated a clever mechanical feature. The antenna could tilt up or down. A small control knob on the instrument panel allowed the pilot to adjust antenna elevation angle. This was critical because the radar beam was relatively narrow, approximately 9 degrees wide. If you searched for aircraft at a different altitude, you needed to physically tilt the antenna to find them. Point it too high, you'd miss low-flying targets. Too low, and high-altitude contacts disappeared. The scan pattern demonstrated sophisticated engineering for 1944 technology. The antenna rotated through 360 degrees, but the system was designed to concentrate attention forward, where threats were most likely. It scanned rapidly through the rear hemisphere, spending minimal time looking backward, then slowed as it swept the forward arc, providing more looks at potential targets ahead. This intelligent scanning improved detection probability significantly, but the system had limitations pilots had to understand intimately or die trying. Ground clutter was the primary challenge. Point the radar at the ocean surface or terrain, and returns completely swamped any aircraft echoes. The scope would bloom with false contacts, rendering it useless. Rain and clouds created similar masking effects. Skilled pilots learned the delicate art of adjusting antenna tilt angle, high enough to minimize ground returns, low enough to still detect aircraft at operationally relevant altitudes. The scope itself used greenish phosphor coating that glowed when struck by the electron beam scanning across it. This required specially designed red lighting throughout the cockpit to preserve night vision. Any white light would destroy a pilot's dark adaptation, leaving him temporarily blind, potentially fatal in nocturnal combat. Everything in the F6F-5N cockpit used red lights, and even those were dimmed to minimum practical intensity. The radar had one critical, potentially lethal limitation: no identification friend or foe capability. Every blip on the scope could be friendly or hostile. Japanese bomber or returning American patrol aircraft. Pilots had to rely on careful procedures, radio coordination with fleet controllers, and pre-briefed routing to avoid fratricide. Despite these precautions, friendly fire incidents occurred more than once when nervous pilots fired at unidentified contacts that turned out to be American. The electronics behind this system were cutting edge for 1944. The transmitter used the magnetron tube, the same technology that would later power microwave ovens, to generate high-frequency radio energy. The receiver used crystal detectors and vacuum tube amplifiers to detect incredibly weak return signals. The display used cathode ray tube technology borrowed from oscilloscopes and early televisions. Maintenance crews had to understand vacuum tube theory, waveguide physics, and antenna alignment, advanced electronics that most mechanics had never encountered. Yet they kept these systems operational under combat conditions, often aboard carriers pitching in heavy seas, with salt spray corroding connections and tropical heat degrading components. The AN/APS-6 represented America's industrial and scientific advantage, distilled into 230 pounds of electronics. While Japanese scientists understood radar theory, they lacked the industrial capacity, specialized components, and engineering experience to produce comparable lightweight airborne systems in quantity. This small pod on the Hellcat's wing was force multiplier technology that changed everything about nocturnal aerial warfare. The radar pod was just the beginning. Converting a standard F6F-5 Hellcat into a night-fighting F6F-5N required extensive modifications throughout the airframe and systems. Start with the obvious, the radar pod on the starboard wing. This 44-inch teardrop fairing created asymmetric drag that pilots had to compensate for, particularly during takeoff and landing when airspeeds were low and control authority limited. The F6F's inherently stable design handled this well. Grumman's engineers had built ruggedness into every aspect, but pilots still needed training to adjust for the slight pull. Inside the cockpit, everything underwent conversion to red lighting. Instruments, switches, warning lights, the radar display, all used specially filtered red illumination. Some pilots complained that red lighting made certain instruments harder to read, particularly altitude and airspeed indicators where precise readings mattered. But there was no alternative. White light meant blindness, and blindness at night meant death. The exhaust system received critical modifications with flame dampeners. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine normally produced significant exhaust flames, especially during high-power operations like takeoff or combat maneuvering. Those flames would destroy the pilot's carefully cultivated night vision and could make the aircraft visible to enemy gunners miles away. Flame dampeners, essentially baffles and shrouds around the exhaust stubs, reduced this problem significantly, though they couldn't eliminate it entirely without strangling engine performance. Some F6F-5N aircraft had armament reduced from 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns to 4, with the outer wing guns removed. This weight reduction partially compensated for the radar installation and improved roll rate slightly. Pilots had mixed feelings about this modification. Fewer guns meant reduced firepower density, but the weight savings improved performance marginally, and 450s still delivered devastating firepower at convergence range. Additional radio equipment was installed for coordination with ground controllers and radar picket ships. Night fighting doctrine relied heavily on controllers who could see the tactical picture on shipboard radar and vector fighters toward threats. This required reliable radio communication, backup frequencies, and procedures for radio failure scenarios. The first production night fighter variant was the F6F-3N, based on the earlier F6F-3 airframe. It proved the concept, but had limitations. The F6F-5N, based on the improved F6F-5 with its more powerful engine variant and refined aerodynamics, became the definitive night fighter Hellcat. Both versions were highly effective, but the Dash 5 had better overall performance and reliability. External identification was straightforward: glossy midnight blue paint scheme instead of standard navy colors, the distinctive radar pod on the right wing, and often red-tinted cockpit lighting visible from outside at night. These aircraft looked sinister, predatory, exactly the image they needed to project. Flying a high-performance carrier-based fighter at night was already among the most dangerous activities in military aviation. Adding the complexity of radar operation and aerial combat made it exponentially more challenging. The Navy had to develop an entirely new training pipeline for night fighter pilots from scratch. First requirement: absolute mastery of instrument flying beyond what day fighter pilots needed. In complete darkness, there was no visual horizon, no way to distinguish up from down, no external references whatsoever except instruments. Spatial disorientation, vertigo, could kill as surely as enemy fire. Pilots practiced under hood for hours, flying with canvas coverings over the cockpit, forcing complete reliance on instruments, until instrument interpretation became instinctive, automatic, subconscious. Then came radar training. Pilots had to learn interpreting the ANAPS-6 display while simultaneously flying the aircraft, maintaining situational awareness, navigating, communicating, and preparing for combat. Remember, there was no radar operator. The pilot did everything himself. This required multitasking ability that few people naturally possessed, and most had to develop through intensive practice. Training squadrons developed specific intercept procedures, borrowed from British experience and adapted to Pacific conditions. Typically, ground controllers or ship-based controllers with larger, more powerful radar systems would detect incoming enemy aircraft first and vector the night fighter toward threats. Controllers would give the pilot compass headings to fly, altitude assignments, and range information. The pilot would fly these vectors until the target appeared on his own radar scope. Once the target appeared on radar, the pilot transitioned from controller-directed intercept to autonomous hunt. He would maneuver to close range, watching the contact on his scope, adjusting heading to maintain pursuit, managing throttle to control closure rate. A trick was approaching from the target's rear hemisphere, the classic 6 o'clock position, while staying outside the enemy's visual detection range. But here's the critical challenge. The AN/APS-6 had a minimum range. Below approximately 300 feet, the radar couldn't reliably track targets due to the electronics limitations and timing constraints. This meant that for the final approach and actual weapons employment, the pilot had to transition from radar tracking to visual acquisition. On a moonless night, against a dark-painted aircraft, this transition moment was incredibly difficult and dangerous. Pilots practiced night gunnery relentlessly against towed targets and drogues. They learned recognizing subtle visual cues that might reveal enemy aircraft in darkness. The faint blue glow of exhaust flames, a slightly darker shadow against the stars, a silhouette briefly visible against clouds illuminated by distant lightning or moonlight. They trained their eyes to detect the smallest anomalies, the tiniest movements. Night carrier operations added another layer of complexity that separated night fighter pilots from even experienced day fighter aviators. Landing on an aircraft carrier in broad daylight was already one of the most demanding tasks in aviation. Threading a 20-ton fighter onto a moving, pitching deck at precisely the right speed and angle. Landing at night on a deck you could barely see, often in combat zones where lights had to be minimized to avoid submarine attack, required extraordinary skill and nerves of steel. Landing signal officers guided night approaches with illuminated paddles, but ultimately, the landing was entirely the pilot's responsibility. Touch down too hard, destroy the landing gear. Miss the arresting wires, go into the barrier or over the side. Drift off centerline, hit parked aircraft. Any mistake could be fatal. Many promising pilots simply couldn't handle the stress and multitasking requirements. The washout rate for night fighter training was significantly higher than for day fighter training. Those who made it through became an elite group within an already elite force. The Night Hunters, specialists in a warfare domain that few could master. The first night fighter squadrons deployed to the Pacific in late 1943 and early 1944. VFN-75, VFN-76, and VFN-77 were the pioneers, operating from both fleet carriers and island bases, learning their deadly trade through trial, error, and occasional tragic mistakes. Early missions were educational experiences paid for in stress and occasional blood. Pilots discovered that actual combat conditions differed significantly from training scenarios in ways both subtle and dramatic. Enemy aircraft didn't fly predictable patterns at constant altitude and speed. The radar sometimes gave confusing returns, false contacts from weather, sea return clutter obscuring real targets. Coordination with controllers was often difficult due to radio problems, incomplete radar coverage, or simple miscommunication under stress. But they scored victories that validated the concept and refined tactics with each engagement. The first confirmed kill by a Hellcat night fighter came in February 1944, when Lieutenant Commander Richard Harmer of VFN-76 shot down a Japanese bomber during a night interception near Truk. More victories followed through spring and summer as pilots gained experience and confidence. Pilots quickly learned that patience was crucial in night interception. Visual dogfights lasted seconds or minutes. Night interceptions often took 30 minutes or more, from initial radar contact to final attack. You might chase a target for 20 miles, making small course corrections as the enemy maneuvered, maintaining radar contact while managing fuel consumption, waiting for the perfect moment to close for the kill. They also learned the absolute importance of trigger discipline and target identification. With no IFF capability, the risk of shooting down friendly aircraft was terrifyingly real. Pilots had to be absolutely certain of target identity before firing, checking with controllers, verifying no friendly flights were in the area, sometimes even making visual identification before opening fire, despite the risk of losing the target. Several close calls taught harsh lessons about identification procedures that were written in blood. The psychological aspect of night fighting was uniquely intense. Imagine flying alone in total darkness, miles from your carrier, hunting an enemy who might be hunting you. Your radar shows a contact, but friend or foe, you close in, straining your eyes for visual acquisition. Suddenly, you spot a shadow, a shape darker than the surrounding darkness. Your heart pounds. You're about to engage in aerial combat, where one mistake means death, and you can barely see your target. Night fighter pilots developed reputations for preternatural calm under pressure. They had to be. Panic or loss of composure meant spatial disorientation, radar misinterpretation, target loss. The best night fighters were hunters, patient, methodical, emotionally controlled even when adrenaline screamed through their veins. By mid-1944, night fighter operations had matured significantly in both capability and doctrine. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, famously remembered as the Marianas Turkey Shoot for the lopsided daytime aerial battles, also featured significant night operations that demonstrated how far night fighter tactics had evolved. Japanese forces, having been devastated during daylight hours with losses approaching 300 aircraft, attempted desperate night attacks against the American fleet. Night fighter Hellcats were launched to defend the task force, working closely with radar picket destroyers that could detect incoming raids at ranges exceeding 50 miles and vector fighters toward threats. Several dramatic interceptions occurred that night. Pilots stalked Japanese bombers in complete darkness, sometimes engaging them within sight of the fleet's anti-aircraft fire, a dangerous position where American gunners might mistake friend for foe. The night fighters shot down multiple attackers, helping blunt the Japanese night offensive and protect the fleet from potentially damaging strikes. But perhaps the most dramatic moment came the following evening in what became known as Mission Beyond Darkness. After American forces launched their own strikes against the Japanese fleet at extreme range, pushing the tactical envelope dangerously, the returning aircraft faced a desperate situation. Many were critically low on fuel, and night was falling rapidly. Admiral Mitcher made the controversial decision to turn on the fleet's lights to guide aircraft home, despite the very real risk of submarine attack. The task force lit up like a city, providing navigation references for fuel-starved pilots trying to find their carriers in gathering darkness. Night fighter pilots played a crucial protective role that evening, flying defensive patrols above the illuminated fleet as hundreds of aircraft attempted to land in semi-darkness. Several aircraft ditched when they ran out of fuel before reaching their carriers. Night fighters helped coordinate rescue operations, circling over downed aircrews and guiding destroyers to survivors' positions, using their radar to locate life rafts in the darkness. This mission demonstrated that night fighters provided valuable capabilities beyond just shooting down enemy aircraft. Nighttime search and rescue, defensive patrols during vulnerable situations, and coordination functions that day fighters couldn't perform effectively after dark. As 1944 turned to 1945 and American forces approached Japan itself, a new and terrifying threat emerged that changed the entire nature of Pacific air warfare: kamikaze suicide attacks. These deliberate suicide crashes were devastating during daylight operations. The thought of kamikaze aircraft attacking at night raised terror to new levels among fleet commanders. The Japanese did attempt night kamikaze attacks, though they were less common than daytime operations due to navigation difficulties and coordination challenges. Each night kamikaze that got through defensive screens could sink a ship, killing hundreds. Night fighter Hellcats became even more valuable. Every successful interception potentially saved hundreds of lives. The Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945 saw the most intensive night fighter operations of the entire Pacific War. Japanese commanders launched numerous night raids against the massive American fleet supporting the invasion, sometimes coordinating night attacks with daytime kamikaze strikes to overwhelm defenses through sheer volume. Night fighter pilots flew multiple missions per night during critical periods, landing to refuel and rearm before launching again into darkness. The physical and mental strain was enormous, but the stakes were absolute. One pilot, Lieutenant Commander William Henry of VFN-41, became famous for shooting down 4 Japanese aircraft in a single night mission on April 12, 1945, an incredibly rare achievement in night fighting. His combat report, preserved in Navy archives, described the intensity: multiple radar contacts, long chases through darkness at varying altitudes, brief moments of visual contact, followed by bursts of gunfire, then back into darkness to hunt another target, while monitoring fuel state and maintaining carrier position awareness. The psychological pressure on night fighter pilots during Okinawa was immense. They were often the last line of defense between kamikaze aircraft and ships full of sailors and Marines. Failure wasn't just losing an engagement. It meant men died, ships burned, operations were disrupted. The weight of this responsibility was crushing, yet the pilots continued flying night after night. As the war progressed, radar technology evolved rapidly. Later production AN/APS-6 units incorporated improvements in reliability, sensitivity, and display clarity. Some late-war F6F-5N aircraft received experimental installations of newer radar systems, though the AN/APS-6 remained standard through war's end. Pilots and maintenance crews became increasingly experienced with the equipment. They learned workarounds for common problems, how to minimize sea return clutter, techniques for detecting low-flying targets against ocean background, methods for distinguishing aircraft from weather returns. Some squadrons developed field modifications to improve performance, streamlined radar pod fairings to reduce drag further, modified cooling ducts to prevent electronics overheating, improved instrument lighting configurations. The Navy also refined intercept tactics continuously. Some squadrons experimented with team tactics, pairs of night fighters working together, with one aircraft focusing on radar search while the second maintained formation and provided backup. This proved challenging due to the extreme difficulty of maintaining formation in total darkness without lights, and the solo hunter approach remained most common. Ground-controlled interception techniques, borrowed from British experience and adapted to Pacific conditions, became increasingly sophisticated. Radar picket destroyers positioned far from the main fleet served as early warning and control stations, detecting threats at long range and vectoring night fighters toward optimal intercept positions. As these procedures matured, intercept success rates improved dramatically. Radio equipment evolved significantly. Early in the war, radio reliability problems frequently hampered night operations, static, range limitations, equipment failures. By 1945, improved VHF radios with better range and clarity made coordination between fighters and controllers much more reliable and effective. Behind all this technology and tactics were the pilots themselves, human beings who volunteered for one of the most demanding assignments in naval aviation. What kind of person chooses to hunt alone in darkness, thousands of feet above a black ocean? Many were experienced day fighter pilots seeking new challenges. Some were naturally gifted instrument pilots who excelled at the technical demands. Others were simply assigned to night fighters because the Navy needed personnel and they met the qualifications. Regardless of how they arrived, all had to master skills that few aviators could claim. The psychological profile of successful night fighter pilots was distinctive. They tended to be patient, methodical thinkers rather than aggressive hotshots. The best night fighters were hunters who could remain calm during long pursuits, who could manage multiple tasks simultaneously without becoming overwhelmed, who possessed excellent spatial awareness even when sensory inputs were minimal or contradictory. They also dealt with unique physiological and psychological stresses. Day fighter pilots might fly multiple missions daily, but they could see their surroundings and react to visual cues instinctively. Night fighter pilots operated in isolation and darkness, often for hours at a time. The sensory deprivation combined with high-stakes combat created psychological pressures different from day operations. Sleep schedules were severely disrupted. Night fighter pilots had to sleep during day and operate at night, fighting against natural circadian rhythms. On carriers, this meant trying to sleep while day flight operations thundered overhead. catapult launches, arresting gear impacts, aircraft moving on deck. On island bases, it meant sleeping in tropical heat while daytime activities continued around them. Despite these challenges, morale in night fighter squadrons was generally high. Pilots took immense pride in their specialized skills. They knew they were doing a job few could do, protecting their fellow servicemen while they slept. The exclusive nature of their specialty created strong unit cohesion and identity. Many night fighter pilots earned significant decorations for their service. Several became aces with 5 or more aerial victories, remarkable achievements given the difficulty of night interceptions. Each victory represented extraordinary skill, determination, and often considerable luck. Let's examine the actual operational statistics. By war's end, F6F Hellcat night fighters had flown thousands of night combat missions and scored over 154 confirmed aerial victories against Japanese aircraft. This might seem modest compared to the thousands of kills scored by day fighter Hellcats, but context matters. Night interceptions were far more difficult, opportunities were fewer, and aircraft spent much of their time on uneventful patrols. The kill-to-loss ratio for night fighters was impressive. Relatively few F6F-5N aircraft were lost to enemy action. The biggest dangers were operational accidents, spatial disorientation leading to loss of control, carrier landing accidents in difficult conditions, mechanical failures forcing bailouts or ditching at night in shark-infested waters. Mission endurance typically ran 2 to 3 hours, though pilots sometimes stretched this to 4 hours or more when hunting particularly elusive targets or when serving as extended patrol. Fuel management was critical. You needed sufficient reserve to locate your carrier in darkness and execute a night landing with enough fuel for a wave-off and second approach if necessary. The typical mission profile: launch at dusk or after full darkness. Climb to patrol altitude, usually between 10,000 and 20,000 feet, depending on tactical situation. Proceed to assigned patrol area coordinates. Orbit while maintaining radar watch and radio communication with controllers. Respond immediately to vectors if enemy aircraft were detected. Prosecute intercepts as opportunities arose. Finally, return to carrier or base when fuel state dictated or when relieved by another patrol. Some missions were completely quiet, hours of patrol with no radar contacts except occasional friendly aircraft. Other missions were intensely busy with multiple intercepts, radar contacts appearing and disappearing, constant maneuvering and communication. The unpredictability added stress. You had to maintain full alertness throughout every mission because threats could appear instantly. Not every mission ended successfully. Close calls and near disasters illustrated the inherent dangers of night operations, even without enemy intervention. Several pilots reported nearly firing on friendly aircraft before recognizing them at the last moment. The identification problem was never fully solved. In darkness, with tension high and adrenaline surging, the temptation to fire at any radar contact was powerful. Only discipline and procedure prevented tragedies, though fratricide incidents did occur despite all precautions. Multiple cases exist of pilots becoming spatially disoriented and nearly flying into the ocean. Without visual references, spatial disorientation could affect anyone, regardless of experience level. Pilots learn to trust instruments absolutely, even when their inner ear and sense of balance screamed that the instruments were lying. Many pilots credit their instrument training with saving their lives when disorientation struck. Mechanical failures at night were particularly dangerous. Engine problems manageable in daylight became life-threatening emergencies in darkness. Several pilots successfully ditched F6F-5N aircraft at night and were rescued. Remarkable achievements considering the difficulty of judging height above water in total darkness. Others were less fortunate. Their aircraft lost with no trace beyond an oil slick found the next morning. Weather posed special challenges. Flying through clouds at night with absolutely no visual references whatsoever was profoundly stressful. Ice could form on the aircraft without the pilot noticing until performance degraded dangerously. Severe turbulence in darkness was terrifying because you couldn't see it approaching or anticipate impacts. Friendly fire incidents occurred despite extensive precautions. Anti-aircraft gunners, tense and trigger-happy during alerts, sometimes fired on friendly night fighters, especially during high-stress situations, when enemy aircraft were definitely in the area. Tracer rounds arcing up toward you in the darkness provided stark reminders that danger could come from any direction, friend or foe. The F6F-5N Hellcat night fighter represented a crucial evolutionary step in night air combat. It proved that single-engine fighters could be effective night interceptors with appropriate equipment and proper training, a lesson that influenced post-war fighter development significantly. Lessons learned during the Hellcat night fighter program influenced jet age developments. The importance of good radar displays with clear presentation, proper cockpit lighting that preserved night vision, comprehensive pilot training and radar interpretation, all these concepts carried forward into Cold War fighters. The AN/APS-6 radar, primitive by modern standards, was remarkably advanced for its time. The basic concept, a small, lightweight airborne radar system operated by the pilot without a dedicated radar operator, became standard for single-seat fighters in the post-war era and remains standard today. Operational procedures developed for night interception, including ground-controlled interception techniques and radar intercept geometry, remained relevant through decades of subsequent development. Modern fighter pilots still learn many of the same basic concepts that Hellcat night fighter pilots pioneered: maintaining radar contact, judging closure rates, managing minimum range transitions to visual acquisition. Perhaps most importantly, the night fighter program proved definitively that with appropriate technology and training, night no longer provided sanctuary to attackers. Enemies could be detected and destroyed in complete darkness, a fundamental change in aerial warfare that resonates through every subsequent conflict. How did the F6F-5N compare to other night fighters of World War II? The British Mosquito night fighter was larger, faster, with more powerful radar and a dedicated radar operator. It was probably the most effective night fighter of the war in terms of overall capability and kill totals. However, it couldn't operate from carriers, severely limiting its usefulness in the Pacific theater, where land bases were scarce and mobile carrier task forces dominated operations. The P-61 Black Widow was purpose-designed as a night fighter from the outset. It was larger than the Hellcat, carried heavier armament, had a radar operator to reduce pilot workload, and possessed excellent performance. But it was also complex, expensive to build, couldn't operate from carriers, and arrived relatively late in the war. It saw limited Pacific service. The Japanese developed their own night fighters, including modified versions of the J-1N Irving twin-engine fighter and adapted versions of other aircraft. However, Japanese airborne radar technology lagged significantly behind American and British developments. Japanese night fighters relied more heavily on visual detection, searchlight cooperation, and pilot skill, far less effective than radar-equipped opposition. What made the F6F-5N special was versatility and practicality. It could operate from carriers, essential for Pacific operations. It had respectable performance that allowed it to catch most Japanese bombers. It was reliable and maintainable under combat conditions. It could be produced in quantity without straining industrial capacity, since it shared most components with standard dayfighter Hellcats. The fact that it was based on an existing, combat-proven airframe meant maintenance and logistics were dramatically simpler. Spare parts were already in the supply system. Mechanics already understood the aircraft systems. Pilots transitioning from dayfighters already knew the handling characteristics. Pilots who flew these missions left accounts that provide insight into the experience of night fighting. They consistently mentioned the profound solitude. You were alone in darkness, far from help, dependent entirely on your own skill and your aircraft's reliability. This created a bond between pilot and machine that dayfighters experienced differently. Your Hellcat wasn't just a weapon, it was your lifeline, your only companion, your protection against the void. They described the sensory experience vividly: the soft red glow of instruments, the eerie green phosphorescence of the radar scope, the darkness pressing in from all sides like physical weight. Some described quiet moments as almost peaceful, meditative even, just you, your aircraft, and the stars. Others found it oppressive, claustrophobic, psychologically exhausting. The moment of visual target acquisition was universally described in intense terms. After following a radar blip for miles, suddenly seeing a dark shape materialize from blackness triggered profound adrenaline responses. Heart racing, hands tightening on controls, everything narrowing down to that single target, the hunter spotting prey. The actual shooting was brief and violent. A burst of gunfire, tracers arcing out into darkness like deadly fireflies, the target aircraft catching fire or exploding, and then silence again. Darkness again. Within seconds, you'd transition from maximum alertness and aggression back to lonely patrol, adrenaline slowly subsiding, hands trembling slightly. Landing back aboard the carrier was consistently mentioned as the most stressful element of any mission. After hours of night operations, fuel running low, you'd have to find the carrier in darkness, a tiny moving speck on an endless black ocean, and execute a perfect approach and landing. Landing signal officers guided with illuminated paddles, but ultimately, the landing was entirely yours. Any mistake could be fatal. Many pilots mentioned the incredible satisfaction of successful missions. Protecting the fleet, shooting down an enemy aircraft, landing safely back aboard. These achievements provided profound satisfaction that made all the stress worthwhile. As the war drew toward its conclusion in August 1945, night fighter operations continued until the very last moments. Even after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while surrender negotiations were underway, night fighters flew protective patrols against possible, final, desperate attacks. When Japan finally surrendered, the night fighter squadrons had proven their worth beyond any doubt. They had shot down over 154 enemy aircraft in nocturnal combat, prevented countless successful attacks on American forces, and developed tactics and procedures that would influence night fighter operations for decades. After the war, most night fighter Hellcats were quickly retired. The rapid advent of jet aircraft changed everything virtually overnight. The F6F-5N and F6F-3N were obsolete almost immediately as the war ended, their piston engines and propellers unable to compete with jet speed and altitude performance. However, their legacy lived on through the pilots and lessons. Veterans who survived took their night fighting experience into the post-war Navy and helped develop the next generation of night fighters, jet aircraft like the F-3D Skyknight and later the F-4D Skyray that carried forward the single-seat, radar-equipped interceptor concept. Some night fighter Hellcats saw brief service in the early Cold War period, but by the late 1940s, nearly all had been scrapped or placed in storage. A few survivors exist today in museums, cherished examples of an important but often overlooked chapter of aviation history. The pilots themselves mostly returned to civilian life, carrying memories of their unique wartime experience. Some continued flying, airline pilots, test pilots, flight instructors. Others pursued entirely different careers, but they had served in one of the most demanding roles in naval aviation history, and they had performed superbly under conditions that would have broken lesser men. Before we conclude, let's examine some deeper technical aspects that made these aircraft special from an engineering perspective. Integration of the radar system required careful aerodynamic and electrical engineering. The radar pod had to be positioned precisely on the wing to minimize drag while maintaining the aircraft's handling characteristics and not creating problematic asymmetric forces. The electrical system had to provide clean, stable power to sensitive radar electronics without creating interference with the aircraft's other radio and electrical systems. The radar display itself was more sophisticated than casual observation might suggest. The cathode ray tube technology was cutting edge for 1944. The phosphor coating had to be carefully formulated to provide good visibility without excessive brightness that would ruin night vision. The sweep circuit that created the rotating radar display had to be precisely synchronized with the antenna rotation mechanism. Any timing errors would misrepresent target positions. The cooling system for the radar represented another engineering challenge. Electronics generate heat, vacuum tubes particularly so, and that heat had to be dissipated in the compact confines of the wing pod. Airflow through the pod provided cooling, but design had to balance cooling requirements against aerodynamic efficiency. Too much cooling airflow meant excessive drag. Insufficient cooling meant component failures. The radar's transmitter operated at significant power levels, around 50 kilowatts peak power during brief transmit pulses. This required robust electrical components capable of handling high voltages and currents reliably in the harsh environment of a combat aircraft experiencing vibration, temperature extremes, and salt spray exposure. The antenna system used a small parabolic reflector, approximately 20 inches in diameter, to focus the radar beam. The waveguide system that carried radar signals from transmitter to antenna and from antenna to receiver had to be precisely manufactured to minimize signal losses. Waveguides are essentially hollow metal tubes with specific cross-sectional dimensions matched to the wavelength. Any deformation or contamination would degrade performance. The receiver was incredibly sensitive for its era. It had to detect extremely weak return signals from aircraft miles away while filtering out noise, interference, and the transmitter's own leakage. The engineering that went into making this work reliably was genuinely impressive. It's intriguing to consider alternate historical scenarios involving night fighter development. If the Japanese had developed better night fighting capabilities themselves, the Pacific Air War might have looked dramatically different. Night bombing raids might have been far more effective against American installations and fleet units. Naval battles might have featured significant night-air combat on both sides, rather than one-sided American dominance of darkness. If radar technology had advanced faster, if the AN/APS-6 had been available in 1942 instead of 1944, early night fighters might have prevented Japanese night harassment raids from ever becoming problematic. The psychological impact on American ground forces might have been significantly reduced. Conversely, if the night fighter program had been delayed or canceled due to technical problems or bureaucratic resistance, American forces would have remained vulnerable to night attacks throughout the war. The psychological toll of constant night harassment could have been significant, affecting morale and combat effectiveness substantially. Some aviation historians have speculated about what might have happened if dedicated night fighter aircraft like the P-61 Black Widow had been adapted for carrier operations despite their size. Would they have been more effective than the Hellcat night fighters? Possibly, but the practical difficulties of operating large twin-engine aircraft from carrier decks probably made the single-engine solution the only realistic option given 1940s technology. The F6F Hellcat night fighter represents an important chapter in World War II aviation history that receives insufficient attention compared to more famous aircraft and battles. While daytime exploits of fighters like the Hellcat, Corsair, and Mustang are widely celebrated and documented, the pilots who hunted in darkness performed equally vital roles under far more demanding conditions. They proved definitively that night no longer provided sanctuary to attackers. With appropriate technology, the AN/APS-6 radar with its rotating antenna and cathode ray display, and proper training, a single-seat carrier-based fighter could effectively hunt and destroy enemy aircraft in complete darkness. This was revolutionary. The technical achievement of integrating functional radar into a carrier-based fighter should not be underestimated. This was genuinely cutting-edge technology for 1944, requiring advances in electronics, antenna design, display technology, and aircraft systems integration. American engineers solved problems that their adversaries couldn't match. The human achievement was equally impressive and perhaps more significant. Pilots who flew these missions demonstrated exceptional skill, courage, and dedication under extraordinarily demanding conditions. They mastered incredibly complex multitasking, flying high-performance aircraft on instruments in total darkness while simultaneously operating radar, hunting enemy aircraft, communicating with controllers, and managing fuel and navigation. And they did this night after night, under combat conditions where mistakes meant death. Their legacy influenced the entire future trajectory of fighter aviation. Every modern fighter with sophisticated radar and comprehensive night fighting capability traces its lineage directly back to pioneering efforts like the Hellcat night fighter program. The lessons learned about radar operation, pilot training, tactics, and procedures remain relevant today. Today, only a few examples of these remarkable aircraft survive in museums. If you ever get an opportunity to see one, take a close look at that streamlined pod on the starboard wing. Inside that innocuous-looking fairing was technology that changed warfare forever, that transformed night from impenetrable sanctuary into lethal hunting ground. The next time you see a modern fighter aircraft with its sophisticated nose-mounted radar and advanced displays in the cockpit, remember the Hellcat night fighters and their pilots. They were the ones who proved it could be done, hunting alone in darkness over the Pacific more than 80 years ago, armed with 230 pounds of electronics and 650 caliber machine guns. They conquered the night. They protected their comrades. They wrote the playbook for nocturnal aerial warfare, and they did it in an aircraft that most people have never heard of, using technology that seems primitive today but was revolutionary in its time. The night hunters of the F6F-5N Hellcat deserve to be remembered. Their story is one of technological innovation, human courage, and the systematic application of American industrial and scientific advantages to solve tactical problems.